The gangplank shuddered under Elara's worn boots, each step a testament to the long voyage. The salty air, so familiar during the journey, now mingled with the scent of damp earth and unfamiliar spices, a heady perfume of a new life. Her heart thumped against her ribs, a frantic bird seeking release. She clutched the simple linen dress she wore, her knuckles white. Thomas, her intended. The man whose letters, though few, had painted a picture of a sturdy farm, a quiet life, and a future she desperately craved after years of hardship. Her gaze swept over the bustling dock, a cacophony of shouting merchants and creaking carts. Then she saw him, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He stood a little apart from the others, his posture radiating an impatient energy. He was exactly as his rough sketch had depicted, if a little more imposing in person. A shy smile touched her lips, and she straightened her shoulders, pushing aside the last vestiges of seasickness. As she drew closer, navigating a tangle of ropes and barrels, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, finally met hers. The expectant warmth in her chest evaporated, replaced by a sudden chill. His brow furrowed, a deep line appearing between his eyes. He took a slow, deliberate step back, his gaze raking over her from head to toe. The smile faltered on her face. You're the one?" His voice was a low growl, laced with a disbelief that stung more than any outright insult. Elara nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, Elara." She extended a hand, a gesture of peace and introduction. He ignored it. His gaze lingered on her slight frame, a dismissive sneer twisting his lips. "I asked for a wife, a helpmate, someone who could actually work a farm. Not a child." He spat the last word, his eyes filled with a disappointment so profound it felt like a physical blow. "What am I supposed to do with you? You're barely big enough to carry a pail of water, let alone haul feed or milk a cow." The color drained from Elara's face. The hopeful flutter in her chest died, replaced by a leaden weight. "I am capable, sir," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm strong, despite my size. I'm a quick learner." He snorted, a harsh, humorless sound. "Capable? You're a liability. My fields are harsh. My animals demand strong hands. I don't have time for a doll to tend to." He turned on his heel, his back a rigid wall of rejection. This was a mistake, a grave mistake. He walked away, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks, leaving Elara standing alone amidst the swirling dust and noise. The bustling port, once a symbol of new beginnings, now seemed to mock her. The scent of foreign spices turned acrid, the shouts of the merchants a deafening clamor. Her vision blurred, the unfamiliar faces around her melting into a watercolor of indifference. A tear, hot and stinging, traced a path down her cold cheek. All her hopes, all her dreams, had shattered on the unforgiving gaze of a stranger. She was adrift, a tiny boat cut loose from its moorings, in a land where no one knew her name, and her intended husband had cast her aside like unwanted refuse. The wind, a biting sculptor, carved goosebumps onto Elara's exposed skin, even through the thin wool of her shawl. The twilight bled into the vast, unfamiliar landscape, painting the distant peaks in bruised purples and inky blacks. She huddled deeper into the roots of a gnarled, ancient oak, the last vestiges of daylight fading like a forgotten dream. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow echo of her despair. She had been walking for what felt like an eternity. The crude map, a crumpled, useless thing in her pocket. A sound, low and resonant, vibrated through the very earth beneath her. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the rustle of leaves. It was deeper, a subterranean hum that rose and fell, closer now, then closer still. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but her legs, weary and trembling, refused to obey. The sound coalesced into a voice, a rumble like distant thunder, yet surprisingly gentle. "Little one, are you lost?" Elara flinched, her head snapping up, her breath hitched. Towering over her, silhouetted against the last sliver of twilight, was a figure of immense proportions. He was impossibly tall, his head nearly brushing the lowest branches of the ancient oak. His shoulders were as broad as a barn door, and his hands, when he slowly lowered one towards her, seemed capable of crushing her with a single careless movement. Yet there was no menace in his posture, only a quiet concern etched into his craggy, weathered face. His eyes, the color of warm honey, held a profound kindness. I am," Elara managed, her voice a reedy whisper against the vastness of the evening. She clutched her shawl tighter, a small, defiant gesture. The giant's smile was slow, a crinkling at the corners of his eyes that softened his imposing features. "Bartholomew! My cottage is not far. It's getting cold out here for someone your size." He extended his enormous hand, palm up, a makeshift platform. "Come, you'll freeze." Elara hesitated, her gaze flicking from his massive hand to his gentle eyes. The world had not been kind to her, and the notion of such unreserved warmth from a stranger, especially one so impossibly large, felt like a trick of the light. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and the offer of shelter, of safety, was a siren song she found impossible to resist. With a deep breath, she placed her small, trembling hand into his. His skin was surprisingly soft, like worn leather. He lifted her with effortless grace, and suddenly, the world seemed to shrink beneath her. Perched on his palm, Elara felt a strange sense of security, the fear slowly beginning to recede, replaced by a nascent curiosity. Bartholomew turned, his stride long and unhurried, and carried her towards the faint glow of a faraway lamp, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Though still vast, the cottage shared its cavernous feel, gradually transforming into a nascent home. Elara spent her initial days in exploration, her footsteps echoing on the extensive wooden floors. Bartholomew had thoughtfully left a generous stack of fresh linens and a slightly singed kettle in her room, accompanied by an elegantly looping note, "Make yourself comfortable. The garden beckons." And beckon it did. A riot of color and fragrance, the garden sprawled beyond Elara's immediate view. Dew-kissed roses, the size of dinner plates, shimmered, while sunflowers stood sentinel, their immense heads tracking the morning sun. Bartholomew was already immersed in its grandeur, a tiny figure tending delicate, iridescent orchids, with hands each the size of Elara's torso. "Morning, Elara," his booming voice, usually a force, was softened by the rustling leaves. "Care to assist a giant with a green thumb?" Elara's grin was genuine, unburdened. "Lead the way, Bartholomew." He gestured towards a sprawling vine heavy with ruby-red berries, many nestled deep within its thorny embrace. "These moonberries are a wily bunch. My fingers are simply too unwieldy to pluck the choicest ones without harming the plant." Elara's eyes gleamed with purpose. She scampered forward, her small frame perfectly suited for navigating the dense foliage. Where Bartholomew saw only a tangled mess, Elara perceived a network of miniature tunnels and hidden nooks. Her nimble fingers easily harvested the ripe berries, dropping them into a woven basket Bartholomew offered, which, to her, seemed the size of a small boat. She found herself crawling beneath colossal leaves, her head brushing against velvety petals, unearthing berries even Bartholomew hadn't suspected. It was a treasure hunt, and she, its most adept seeker. From his property's edge, Thomas observed, ostensibly mending a fence, his gaze perpetually drifted towards Bartholomew's impossibly sprawling garden. He watched the giant, a silhouette of quiet, patient strength, then glimpsed Elara, a vibrant flicker of motion, darting amidst colossal stalks. Her laughter, high and clear, drifted on the breeze. He saw her tackle a particularly stubborn cluster of berries, her entire arm vanishing into the tangle, then reappearing in triumph. A strange coil tightened in Thomas's gut, a concoction of envy and an unnamed sensation, like a seed of regret taking root in barren ground. He clenched his grip on the hammer, splintering the wood with involuntary force. The sky, a bruised canvas of purple and charcoal, began to weep. Not gentle, life-giving tears, but a furious downpour that lashed against the farmhouse windows. Elara, huddled by the hearth, watched the flickering shadows dance on the rough-hewn walls, a stark contrast to the growing chaos outside. The wind, at first a mournful sigh, quickly escalated into a banshee's shriek, tearing at the eaves and rattling the very foundations of the old house. Bartholomew, towering even when stooping to peer out, muttered about the approaching tempest, his brow furrowed with concern. Then came the crack, a sound like a giant's whip snapping through the air, followed by a resonant thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Elara instinctively clutched her homespun dress. Bartholomew, without a word, grabbed a thick, oilskin coat and strode towards the door, his usual calm replaced by a grim determination. Elara, despite the terrifying roar of the wind, felt a familiar surge of concern for him. She knew his farm was his life, and she sensed the thud had been ill tidings. She followed him out into the maelstrom, the rain instantly plastering her hair to her face and soaking through her thin shawl. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and splintered wood. They fought their way against the gale, each step a struggle, until the barn loomed into view, a dark silhouette against the lightning-streaked sky. Her heart sank. One of the massive wooden doors, wrenched from its hinges, lay splayed across the muddy ground, a gaping wound in the barn's side. Straw and hay, caught in the wind's merciless grasp, swirled like a golden blizzard. Bartholomew stood before the damage, his massive frame dwarfing the splintered timber. He ran a hand over the broken frame, his knuckles white. The remaining door, though still attached, hung precariously, its upper hinge bent into a grotesque twist. He tried to push it back into place, but even his immense strength couldn't overcome the twisted metal and the sheer weight of the waterlogged wood. He grunted, a sound of frustration and defeat, then looked up at the broken hinge, a good 10 feet above the ground. His shoulders slumped. The giant, who could fell trees with an axe and move boulders with his bare hands, stood defeated by a simple broken hinge. Elara, watching him, saw a vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. He was strong, yes, but this was a problem of leverage and height, not brute force alone. He turned to her, his gaze holding a quiet despair. "Too high," he rumbled, the wind snatching at his words. "I can't reach it." Elara's courageous climb. The wind howled a mournful cry that rattled the windows of Bartholomew's farmhouse. Elara, stirring soup at the hearth, glanced towards the barn. A low, guttural growl rumbled from outside, followed by a series of frustrated thuds. She knew that sound. Bartholomew, gentle giant though he was, grew deeply distressed when things weren't as they should be. Peeking through the pantry window, she saw him wrestling with the barn door, its top hinge wrenched free and dangling precariously. He was a mountain of a man, strong enough to fell an oak with a single swing, but the angle and height of the broken hinge rendered his strength useless. His broad shoulders slumped, and he ran a massive hand through his already disheveled hair, a picture of defeated frustration. Elara's heart ached for him. He'd done so much for her, providing a sanctuary when she had none. This was her chance to contribute, to show him she wasn't just another mouth to feed, a small, fragile thing to be protected. Her mind raced, sifting through possibilities. His hands, though capable of immense tenderness, were too large for the delicate work needed so high up. An idea sparked, audacious and a little terrifying. She hurried out, the biting wind whipping her skirts. "Bartholomew!" she called, her voice thin against the gale. He turned, his usually warm eyes clouded with worry. "The hinge," she began, pointing. "It needs to be guided back into place. You can't reach, but I might be able to." He looked at her, then at the towering barn door, then back at her, a slow understanding dawning in his kind face. "Elara," he rumbled, his voice laced with concern, "it's a long way up, and dangerous." "I'm small, Bartholomew, but I'm not clumsy," she insisted, her chin lifting. "If you hold the ladder steady, I can climb. I can guide the pin back in." He hesitated for another moment, then a glimmer of hope replaced the despair in his eyes. He retrieved the tallest ladder, a behemoth that dwarfed even him, and positioned it against the barn wall. The rungs looked impossibly far apart, each one a significant step for her small frame. Her palms grew damp, a nervous tremor starting in her knees, but she wouldn't back down. Taking a deep breath, Elara began her ascent. Each rung groaned under her weight, amplified by the fierce wind. Bartholomew stood beneath her, his massive hands braced against the ladder, a silent anchor. "Steady, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low thrum against the wind's shriek. "Just a little higher." She reached the top, the broken hinge at eye level. It was a delicate maneuver, requiring precision. With Bartholomew's steadying presence below, she carefully maneuvered the heavy iron pin, her fingers numb with cold and exertion. It clicked into place with a satisfying thud. The door, once a gaping maw, now swung securely. She descended, trembling slightly, but with a surge of exhilaration. Bartholomew met her at the bottom, his face crinkling into a wide, genuine smile. "You did it, Elara," he said, his voice thick with admiration. He looked at her not as a tiny, helpless creature, but as a capable, courageous woman. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but profound respect, and a warmth that chased away the last of the cold. The bruised palette of the late afternoon sky, purples and oranges bleeding into one another, drenched Widow's Peak, stretching the shadows long and grotesque across Thomas's fields. He leaned against the sun-baked fence, a familiar dull ache blooming in his lower back, arms crossed. But his gaze bypassed his meticulously tilled rows, snagging instead on the disarray erupting at the fringe of Elara's land. A yelping bundle of fur no larger than a badger had somehow ensnared itself in the thorny briar patch bordering the old creek. Its frantic, reedy cries carried with unsettling clarity on the still air. Then Elara materialized, a muted blue against the drab undergrowth, a sudden splash of color. Thomas watched, a grudging curiosity uncoiling within him. He fully expected a flurry of useless fussing, perhaps a call for assistance, or even a capitulation. Instead, she knelt, her slight frame dwarfed by the wild brambles. A flicker of hesitation then, with surprising resolve, she began to meticulously extricate the terrified animal. Thorns snagged her sleeves. He could almost feel the sharp pinpricks as her delicate hands navigated the dense thicket. The dog, sensing her intent, whimpered but ceased its desperate struggles. A ripple of something akin to admiration, quickly quashed, stirred within Thomas. He recalled his harsh dismissal, the cutting words about her stature, her perceived inadequacy. He'd scoffed at her gentle nature, convinced she was ill-suited for the brutal realities of farm life. Yet here she was, not merely confronting a minor crisis, but handling it with a quiet competence that defied her size. He saw her wince as a particularly vicious thorn bit into her forearm, a pearl of crimson blossoming on her pale skin. Still, she neither flinched nor cried out. Her focus remained steadfastly on the trapped creature. Finally, with a soft tug, the dog was free, scrambling into her arms, lavishing her face with fervent, slobbery gratitude. Elara cradled it close, stroking its matted fur, a soft smile gracing her lips, even as she dabbed at her bleeding arm with the hem of her apron. Thomas's jaw tightened. He'd been so swift to judge, so blinded by his own ingrained assumptions and insecurities. The memory of her tear-filled eyes as he'd sent her away earlier that week seared into his consciousness. He'd devalued her worth based on shallow perceptions, certain she could offer no real contribution, no genuine help. Now, watching her soothe the small dog, a profound and unexpected regret settled over him, heavy and cold as a winter fog. He had misjudged her terribly. A fool, that's what he was. The bitter, sharp taste of his own pride filled his mouth. The morning after the squall, a persistent damp chill still clung to the air, yet the sun, piercing through, illuminated a landscape of scattered debris. Elara, a diminutive figure, moved with surprising dexterity through Bartholomew's ravaged yard. She didn't just direct. She lifted, sorted, and strategically planned. The old shed, its roof a shattered mosaic of timbers, demanded immediate attention. Bartholomew, his immense hands surprisingly tender, mirrored her efforts, effortlessly hoisting fallen beams that would have crushed a lesser person. He'd pause, his deep-set eyes tracking her swift movements, then anticipate her unspoken need. A larger stone for the foundation, a precisely placed plank. Across the muddy lane, Thomas, his face still etched with the previous night's anxieties, observed from his porch. His own fences, a testament to robust construction, had largely weathered the storm, but the sight of Bartholomew and Elara collaborating, a vivid contrast to his earlier dismissive judgment, began to chafe. He now perceived Elara not as the little thing he'd scoffed at, but as a whirling dervish of efficiency, her laughter occasionally flitting on the breeze as Bartholomew, clumsy yet effective, followed her directives. Bartholomew, in turn, appeared not as a hulking menace, but a diligent, if somewhat awkward, partner, his immense strength undeniably vital. Later that afternoon, as Bartholomew carefully resecured a section of the shed's wall, Elara extended a mug of steaming tea. He accepted it with a grateful nod, their gazes meeting. A silent shared understanding, forged in their collective toil, sparked between them. A few townsfolk, venturing out to survey their own damage, passed by. Martha, typically a fount of gossip, hesitated, then offered a small, tentative wave towards Bartholomew. He returned it with a slow, almost shy acknowledgement. Young Timmy, usually one to cower behind his mother's skirts at the sight of the giant, now stood agape, marveling at the ease with which Bartholomew hoisted a felled oak branch. The shift was subtle initially, a collective recalibration of perception. Whispers once tinged with suspicion now carried a different resonance. "Did you see how she handles him?" someone murmured, a note of admiration woven into their voice. "And he actually listens," another added, a quiet revelation. The townsfolk began to discern Elara's quiet fortitude, her pragmatic intellect. They witnessed Bartholomew's protective regard, his unexpected deference to her judgment. The image of the giant, once a solitary, intimidating monolith, was slowly being softened and reshaped by the presence of the small, determined woman by his side. Thomas, still on his porch, watched the changing tide, a knot of something akin to regret tightening in his stomach. The community, it seemed, was beginning to grasp what he had so stubbornly refused to see. The path to Bartholomew's cottage, usually a familiar track of packed earth, felt impossibly long and uneven under Thomas's worn boots. Each step was a silent accusation, a reminder of the sharp words he'd flung and the quiet dignity with which Elara had absorbed them. The sun, a harsh yellow disk in the sky, seemed to mock his discomfort, highlighting the sweat on his brow and the slump in his shoulders. He felt small, smaller than he'd ever admitted to himself, especially as Bartholomew's formidable silhouette grew larger with every stride. He found them in the small garden Elara had coaxed into being around the cottage, a vibrant explosion of marigolds and climbing beans. Bartholomew was carefully staking a tomato plant, his large hands surprisingly gentle, while Elara knelt, humming softly as she weeded around a cluster of herbs. The scene was one of quiet domesticity, a stark contrast to the barren silence of his own farmhouse. Thomas cleared his throat, the sound a rough rasp in the afternoon stillness. Both heads turned. Elara's eyes, once so timid, now held a steady, knowing gaze. Bartholomew straightened, his presence filling the small space. "Elara?" Thomas began, his voice surprisingly thin. He swallowed, gathering his resolve. I came to apologize." He looked at the ground, then back at her, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I was a fool, a proud, blind fool. You deserve better. I was wrong about you. About everything." He paused, the words tasting like ash. "If you would consider it, I'd be honored if you'd return to the farm. I can offer you a home, a proper life." Elara looked from Thomas's contrite face to Bartholomew, who stood silently, his expression unreadable. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby oak, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming lavender. A soft smile touched her lips, not one of triumph, but of quiet understanding. "Thomas," she said, her voice clear and kind, "I appreciate your words. Truly I do. It takes courage to admit one's mistakes." She stood, brushing soil from her apron. "But my home is here now. My life is here." She gestured around the small garden, then placed a hand lightly on Bartholomew's arm. "Bartholomew, he saw me, truly saw me, when no one else did. He offered me kindness, respect, and a place where I belong." Her gaze returned to Thomas, unwavering. "I am content. This is where I am meant to be." Thomas stood there, the weight of her words settling upon him. The truth of them was undeniable. He had lost her, not to another man, but to his own harshness, and in doing so, she had found her own strength. He nodded slowly, a profound sense of loss mingling with a grudging respect. "I understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned and began the long walk back, the path now feeling even heavier than before. The morning sun, filtered through the rustling leaves of ancient oak trees, dappled the small cottage and the expansive garden surrounding it. Elara, humming a soft tune, meticulously tended to her rows of blooming lavender. Her nimble fingers moved with practiced grace, plucking stray weeds and gently stroking the fragrant blossoms. Bartholomew, his immense form a familiar and comforting presence, was carefully lifting a large, overturned wheelbarrow, revealing a cluster of plump, ripe pumpkins. He moved with a surprising delicacy for his size, his broad hand cradling a particularly robust gourd, as if it were a fragile bird's egg. "They're coming along beautifully, aren't they, Bart?" Elara called out, her voice a melodious chime against the gentle breeze. Bartholomew rumbled in agreement, his deep voice carrying easily across the garden. "Indeed, Elara. Soon, we'll have more pumpkin pie than we know what to do with." A wide smile stretched across his face, crinkling the corners of his kind eyes. They worked in comfortable silence, a rhythm developed over weeks and months of shared tasks. Elara, despite her small stature, was a force of nature in the garden, her knowledge of herbs and plants seemingly boundless. Bartholomew, with his strength, cleared paths, moved stones, and protected their burgeoning crops from the occasional woodland creature. Their home, once a lonely outpost, now bustled with life and the quiet hum of two souls content in each other's company. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they sat on the porch swing Bartholomew had carefully constructed. It was built for his frame, a sturdy contraption of thick timbers, but Elara found her own comfortable nook amidst the woven cushions. She sipped her herbal tea, the warmth seeping into her hands, while Bartholomew thoughtfully carved a small wooden bird, its delicate wings already taking shape under his skilled fingers. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" Elara murmured, gazing out at the twilight-kissed landscape. Bartholomew nodded, his eyes distant as he concentrated on his carving. "More peaceful than I ever imagined possible." He paused, then looked at her, his expression soft. "You brought that peace, Elara." A blush touched Elara's cheeks. "And you, Bartholomew, gave me a place to find it." She reached out, her small hand resting briefly on his massive forearm. The gesture was simple, yet it spoke volumes of the trust and affection that had blossomed between them. Their friendship, a curious blend of big and small, had become a quiet legend in the nearby village. Initially met with whispers and wary glances, the villagers had come to see the genuine connection between the tiny woman and the gentle giant. When Elara needed supplies, Bartholomew would accompany her, his imposing presence a silent guardian. When Bartholomew needed assistance with a delicate task, Elara's precise touch was invaluable. They were a testament to the idea that acceptance wasn't about size or expectation, but about the heart. Their porch, with its swing and the scent of brewing tea, had become a beacon of their enduring bond, a place where their big hearts beat in harmonious rhythm, forever intertwined.